if we go for a landscape approach, how does that fit with the existing institutional structures? What is the role of those institutions in a landscape approach? It's a fairly open question, but I'll leave it at that. Secondly, one of the points of doing this as a landscape approach is that we will combine the efforts of several sectors, and by that, hopefully be able to raise those issues to a higher political level. Will that really work? And thirdly, and maybe of interest to many of us, if we go for a landscape approach, which seems technically and possibly institutionally the right thing to do, how does that fit with current priorities of our donors? So those are the three backdrop questions that I'm teeing up. And to the extent that you have answers to these, I would very much like to hear that. So I've asked Matthew to go first. So if you're ready, Matthew, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank you to all of you who've come to hear it. I guess in a way, maybe I'll just start where you left off, Peter, where you said that it's not controversial, and I guess it is no way that the landscape approach could be controversial. It's almost blindingly obvious that if you're going to manage resources, you need to look at the whole resource, work out how to make the best of it without destroying it, and then manage accordingly. So maybe the surprising thing about this is that we're having the debate now in Forest Day 6 rather than right at the beginning of the process. So it should be obvious, but obviously it's not always been obvious, and certainly in the way that things are managed, it's not always obvious. From the point of view of my Department for International Development within the UK, you would think, again, it should just come naturally to us. We have a fund, a 2.9 billion fund for climate fund called the International Climate Fund, which is over a 4-year period out to 2015. So that gives, first of all, it's a substantial fund, and also there is an element of predictability about the financing there. And we aim to spend about 20% of that, so about £600 million on forestry-related activities. And the reasons that we continually advance for wanting to do that are, first of all, 1.2 billion people depend on forests. Secondly, something like 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is within forests. And then thirdly, forests are responsible for, figures are all different, but take your pick, but 15, 17% of global emissions. So immediately you see there's people, there's environment, biodiversity, there's the climate aspects, and you would think it would pull together. But there are some real challenges, and challenges that we face, I think, in terms of actually putting that into practice. I mean, in terms of forests in particular, of course, they're systematically undervalued, and we heard that this morning from Mr. Wu when he was speaking. And we're involved in supporting some of the processes to try and value forests better so that then you can actually make planning more effective. Secondly, getting good results in working in forested areas and forested landscapes has proved really, really hard for just about anyone who's tried, be it NGOs, private sector, governments, or in our case, development partners. And we all know the reasons why. I won't repeat them now, related to governance, land tenure, the multiple number of stakeholders concerned, the remoteness of many areas, corruption, and so on. And certainly, personally in my career, I think the hardest decision I ever took was actually to close a forestry program for those reasons. So it's always been very difficult. And then I think the other thing is that we are, and this comes to your question, Peter, on institutions, is that I think certainly among development partners we tend to be very siloed. That fund I mentioned earlier is actually managed by 3 departments within the UK, and we try and work together, but obviously that is something that has to be managed. And then within my own organisation, I'm responsible for the budget for forests, but there's another department that's responsible for the budget for food and agriculture and nutrition, and yet another one who's responsible for building resilience to disasters and so on. So I think we have some real challenges there. So how can we do better, or how can we manage this? I think maybe just 2 principles, and then I'll just give a very brief description of what we're trying to do. I guess one principle is that governance and land tenure really underpins everything in this area, and we have to get those right. And the other one is relating to local communities. We have to listen to local communities and how they want to use the resources they've got, whether they're forests, whether they're agricultural land, or whatever it might be, whether it's watersheds. We have to listen to them. And I have very personal experience of that. As a boy, I used to play football with my friends on a little piece of lawn, communally owned, never really knew who owned it. And one day the council kindly came and planted some trees on it. And then with the tacit agreement of our parents, within about a week, they'd all disappeared. They'd all been kicked down. So I know that if you don't involve communities in decisions that are made, then you end up wasting, in this case, wasting resources and degrading one's landscape. So I think they're two principles. How are we in DFID trying to address some of them? Well, we're doing them through a number of our programs. We are supporting a forest governance, markets and climate change program, which is working very much on drivers of, it is forest focused, so it's working on drivers of deforestation, primarily focused so far on timber, but we're gradually expanding that to work on a number of other commodities and so on. So that really takes us right into the agriculture space and so on. And some of the principles I mentioned on governance, transparency, underpin that program. So we're trying to make sure that we're doing things in a transparent way and taking a much more broad landscape approach than we might have done in the past. We're very proud to be supporting a program we call CIFOR, but essentially is providing support to 3 organizations, CIFOR, the Pro4 organization, which many of you will know, and IUCN. The IUCN component is particularly focused on landscape restoration, but the reason that we're doing this through a single program is that we want to make sure that the synergies between the work of all of them are reaped. So IUCN on the restoration, the CIFOR work, the research and analytical work, and then the Pro4 work, which is more focused on specific policy and application. So trying to bring those things together in a way which can then take a much broader landscape approach. And then finally, and then I'll stop, we're developing a new program that was announced at an event in London earlier this week by one of our ministers, developing a new program with multiple stakeholders, private sector, communities, governments and so on, to really look at trying to respond to some of the drivers of deforestation that were being discussed this morning. So there's a component around demand, the demand in developed and some of the emerging markets for products, trying to make sure the demand is for certified and products that are not actually driving deforestation. There's a focus on creating enabling conditions, some of the land tenure issues I mentioned earlier. And then 2 other focuses, one on greenfield work, working with forest communities so that communities can maximize the benefits from forest land, using agroforestry techniques and others to add value to the forest land, so trees are worth more standing than cut down. And then a brownfield, as we call it, to contrast with the greenfield approach, in trying to increase productivity and production on degraded land, enable local communities, perhaps as smallholder outgrowers or whatever, to be able to benefit from the use of brownfield land. So in this kind of approach, I think a landscape approach almost inevitably becomes part of the program and has to be key. So this is what we're trying to do. It'd be great to get your ideas, particularly for this program under design, on how we can make sure that we do it in practice. Because I think Peter does put his finger, and I'll conclude on this, does put his finger on a really important institutional question. He asked the question, well, is it that if we bring all these different elements together that have been traditionally ministers of environment, ministers of agriculture, ministers of water, can we get higher political push behind them? I hope we can, but of course the risk is that if everyone's responsible, nobody's responsible. So the risk is you might actually get less, and I think that's going to be a real challenge to all of us in terms of managing a landscape approach going forward. But I'm convinced it's the right way to go, and we in DFID are really committed to it, and really hoping to learn more over these days on how we can do it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I take 2 points here which are important to me. One is that it's the right way to go. And secondly, if we go that way, forest issues will still be very important. And I think that's a message that can be repeated in here today. And I think we should all remember that. Thank you. Mary, how does this fit with the World Bank strategies?
So, can you hear me? There you go. No? I'm just going to hold it like that. Okay, so I think that it's great that Forest Day is going towards a Landscape Day, and it reflects our own efforts inside the World Bank Group this year. We underwent a realignment of our own departments and moved much of our environmental work on environmental economics and on biodiversity into the agriculture department. which is now known as the Ag and Environmental Services Department. We haven't quite completed the transition because the parts of forestry which are with carbon finance and the forest investment program under the climate investment funds are still on the climate side. But we're moving in that direction. And I think, you know, we feel that it's essential to do so. The World Bank president launched a report last week called the 4-Degree World and Why It Must Be Avoided. In this report, we worked with the scientific community to reconfirm the science that we all know around climate change, but also to point out that if we meet all the current pledges, we're headed for a world that is superior to 3 degrees anyway. And that the window to stay in a 2-degree world is closing very rapidly. And the report has a lot to say about what a 4-degree world might look for that's relevant for a landscape approach. With respect to extreme heat events and drought, such as the ones that Russia had in 2003 or the one that Europe had in 2007, the United States had in 2011 and 2012, it points out that food security is going to take on a whole new dimension. And with respect to the forest, it basically talks about the dieback of the Amazon, but it's not something that is in the distant future. I think some of you may have seen an article which was in the journal Nature, I think in October, which talks about what happened in the forest fires in New Mexico last year, and the fact that the forest is not regenerating because it happened during an extreme heat event and the fire was too hot for the seeds to regenerate the forest. So this is something where we feel like we have to move more quickly and we have to move in a cross-sectoral coordinated manner. And as we do that and we think about the need for adaptation, trees are really still our heroes in the sense that they are working across our need for water, our need to sequester carbon, our need for productivity, and our need for benefits to local people. And we think that moving towards a landscape approach is going to help us with both the move to what we like to call sustainability 2.0. That's really a new look at how we are valuing supply chains and food. And you all, some companies are moving in that direction maybe because they want to address concerns about their corporate image. And we all remember the sort of horrific ad which Greenpeace put out targeting Nestle on their destruction of the rainforest with particular emphasis on orangutans. But the other companies that we're working with are more and more concerned legitimately about their own supply. So if you think about what Rio Tinto and Coca-Cola and power utilities all have in common, it's the need for good management of watersheds. I think that, you know, we see that across the board with cosmetic companies, with pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of move in that direction, and it really requires a landscape approach in order to take advantage of that. There's still a counterfactual which says that in a world where we need to increase production of food and increasingly try to feed 7 billion or 8 billion or 9 billion people, that the pressure to do that will cause us to allow agriculture to invade the forests. But the bank looked at that a couple of years ago and came to the conclusion that it is possible to meet the growing demands for food without invading the forests. In order to do that, though, we need better policies. And I think that the sectoral silos have prohibited some of that. And I think as we move towards looking more closely at land tenure issues, that a landscape approach is going to be essential. We're right now working with the government of Mexico on that through the Forest Investment Program under the Climate Investment Funds. And I think there's a lot of understanding or growing learning, I guess, about how you can actually put this landscape approach into practice. And then the second part of the policy has to be a better focus on valuing ecosystem services. And I think we've been talking about that a lot since Rio, how countries can value their natural capital, but also at the micro level, how you can look more closely at the value of a watershed or the value of mangroves or the value of a forest. The example which we most frequently like to use is coming from mangroves, where if you take their timber value, it's $1,000 per hectare, roughly. If you add in the value of the fisheries and the shrimp or seafood that are produced in the mangroves, it goes up to $20,000 per hectare. But if you add in the protection against storm surge that mangroves provide, then you can talk about a value of $40,000 per hectare. And if we can do that more and more, we can make better decisions by understanding the real price of some of our natural capital. I think that the one thing we have to remember all this, and Matthew made several references to it, is that landscapes are not just a playground for figuring this out. They are places where people live and communities exist. And I think that it's very encouraging, really, to see the work that's going on under Red Plus on that. I used to work in Cameroon as the bank's country director, and I was very encouraged to note that now in Cameroon, 40% of the Red Plus coordinators are women. And I think they've been brought into the dialogue much more successfully. I also note that under our work on the Forest Carbon Partnership Fund, we have a pretty profound Indigenous peoples dialogue and have gotten to the point where agreeing that benefit sharing must be a mandatory part of all transactions. And so I think we're making progress on some of the tricky issues that surround a landscape approach, but we still have our work cut out for us. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. And I think we all have seen the 4-degree report. That's scary reading indeed. I'd like very much to hear that there are experiences underway in some countries on what do we actually mean and what happens if we take a landscape approach. And also, of course, that we're not talking about the biophysical landscape, we're talking about the landscape with people in it, and that's important. Thank you. Now, I'd like to turn to Isildha and listen to the IIED perspective and your perspective on these questions.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think most of the aspects related to our landscape have been mentioned. The importance of landscapes, not only in terms of looking at the diversity of biophysical features within these landscapes and their connectivity, but also I think they bring the importance of cross-sector coordination and the interplay of the different drivers which change the landscapes. I think to maintain the functionality of this landscape, it is important for us to look at how agriculture, the logging, the energy supply, mining activities, infrastructure, etc., are impacting on the health of the landscapes. Many countries have adopted the development corridor approach. which means that they identify the richness of resources in terms of soil and productivity of the soil, the water resources, the minerals, and it is in these development corridors and in these landscapes that they focus their development priorities. Therefore, we have to find ways of using the resources to meet the development needs and the poverty reduction targets while maintaining and sustaining the life of the landscapes. And I think one of the key issues, which is not new, is the need for sector coordination between the various institutions, not just looking at agriculture and forestry talking more, but it's also bringing institutions like the Ministries of Planning, the Ministries of Finance, which make key decisions about development in the countries and about allocation of resources for implementing those development initiatives that have to be brought on board and devise together the development priorities and trying to maintain the life of the landscapes. And I think this also calls for a more integrated planning process. I think we have been talking about this, but I don't think we have achieved, and we still need to try and bring all sectors together to make an integrated plan and an integrated process of managing the development needs and the health of the landscapes. As it was mentioned previously, within landscapes there are people, but I would also want to emphasize that there are actors, which are farmers, which are using the landscape for using the land to meet their subsistence needs, but also for commercial purposes. We have investors in various sectors, in forestry, in mining, in agriculture, development of infrastructure. Those investors also need to be part of the process of planning and devising ways of using better the landscapes. But we also have important players, the local government, which is responsible for implementation of the plans. And the NGOs, who play a very important role and interface between policy and practice, between the role of government and outreach to local communities to help them adopt the measures that will contribute to meeting their needs and their development needs, but also trying to adopt sustainable management approaches. I think one of the key lessons from me looking at the rural development and engagement of local communities and other actors in sustainable management, I see 3 or 4 key aspects or lessons that I've learned. I think education is a key, not just at the higher level, at the national level, but you have to invest in education across the board, from the national level to the farmer, to the land user who will be able to adopt new ways of using the resources. And information availability in a language. We all do research here. We publish books. We publish even smaller, policy briefings. But we have to also work in packaging our messages for those who are not so acquainted with the language that we use in our different levels, whether it's government or as a researcher and others. So it is important to package the science in a simplified manner for people to make use of that science. The other aspect which I think is important, and it has been mentioned already, is I'm just going to stress, is the issue of strengthening the rights of local communities, but also other users. Rights to land, rights to forests, and now we are talking more and more about the rights to ecosystem services. We are talking about carbon, watershed, and others. It is important to strengthen and clarify the rights to all these resources. I think we cannot, having rights and having information will not make the population go less hungry or the systems work better. Therefore, I think we have to work in devising technologies and techniques that people can use to increase the productivity of agriculture, to increase the efficiency of producing biomass energy, to look for alternatives, sources of energy, etc. So I think that's also a key aspect. And for that to happen, you need availability of finances to enable the land users to change their practices, as well as having markets which will pay a just price for the products and services that will be generated out of that process. And I would really like to stress that we have learned enough that 2 5-year projects that we go and we try to work with local people to change, they are not sufficient to change the practices, to give, to strengthen the rights, to give them the means to increase the productivity, etc. You need long-term financing commitment for affecting any change and better management of the landscapes. I would like to end by saying that I think RED, it's really giving us a renewed opportunity to discuss across sector about how we can align the development of needs and the poverty reduction imperatives that we face with the need to sustain the landscapes and reduce emissions. I would like to end my intervention from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isildha. That's a very, very nice introduction to the wide range of actors that we need to work with to make the landscape approach a success, and particularly reaching even beyond the agriculture and forestry sectors. That is going to be quite important. So thank you. Justin, now the big picture question may be left for you.
It'll have to be a big picture from me. Thank you very much, Peter. And can I say, from my perspective, how grateful I am for the invitation to be here. Australia and the Australian government works very closely with the CIFOR, and we do value very much the partnership that we have with CIFOR, so if I could just say that. But I feel at a great disadvantage having parachuted into your Forest Day straight here today. The landscape approach is something that's entirely new to me as another piece of jargon. I thought, having been in climate change through the course of this year, every time I go into a session I hear another new piece of terminology, and landscape approach is another new piece of terminology for me. But as a geographer by training, the very unpopular and dying field of geography, it's actually somewhat reassuring to hear that we're going back to taking broad landscape type approaches. So it's, I won't have the advantage of having heard your conversations of developing that concept over the last day or so, but more thinking about how it might be applied from the understanding that I've briefly heard here today. Taking an approach that goes broadly across sectors and looks comprehensively at the environment, I think is very important. I think it's interesting that everything that's old is new again, and I understand this has been talked about in development theory and other areas previously, and the only one area of policy I recall in the past was integrated area development type projects, and their popularity in the late 80s and early 90s, and I'm not sure if this is related, and that experience has already been discussed. But I recall that it was an approach which tried to look at it very comprehensively across development issues, but it was an approach from our development experience also created some inefficiencies in the way that it operated. So I just put that on the table as an issue that in trying to take a broad perspective, I think it's fundamentally very important. But when you're trying to address the key issues, perhaps you look at the things that are really what are central, what are the central issues. And I think within a climate change perspective, I think, again, to make our projects effective, we need to be having very broad perspectives, but we also need to be doing the things that are having the most significant impacts. So that combination, and I'm not trying to suggest that one is more or less important than the other, but that combination of efficiency, I think, in what we do has to be potentially considered and fleshed out as an issue. That said, there's no doubt that the issues that we're dealing with are very cross-sectoral, and particularly if it's in the climate change context, if it's in the context of trying to develop projects that are effective in a climate change context, or within forests, trying to get the broad benefits of forests and making sure that they're beneficial to communities as well, local communities, national communities, and internationally, you do have to take a very broad approach. And I think going from the specific, we had our colleagues, no doubt you've already heard them, from Australia's experience with REDD+ projects in Indonesia. Clearly, there has to have been very detailed types of things that we're talking about here in terms of taking into account governance issues, taking into account land tenure issues, and having the communities at the heart of what we're doing. So there's no doubt that for those projects and our immediate experience, that this type of broad approach and cross-sectoral approach has to be what we're looking at. Similarly, you recognise that the obstacles to such an approach, which perhaps generate the inefficiencies that I'm talking about, are so well established, and again, we all know those. We all know the problems working in developing and developed countries about the siloing of agencies, the long history of identities that forestry departments, agriculture departments, other ministries have set up, and that if such a landscape approach does help to conceptualise the breaking down of those, if it does help to indicate that agencies need to be working together, or the most effective approach is to bring agencies together to deal with an issue, then it's good if it's driving that institutional change. And again, a practical example I can think of that is our own in Australia Department of Climate Change, which is a very new department, set up in 2008 in order to respond to the challenge of climate change. And as somebody who's working in our foreign ministry for the last 17 years, I have to say what a great relief it is to work in an agency that does have, which is deliberately brought together in order to tackle a problem which has got people from across government agencies. And I think any of us who work in government know that it is very hard to coordinate across government agencies, and you do need that recognition that a problem is cross-sectoral, and then having the problem drive the institutional response and the development of new institutions. So I think if you've got that concept and it leads to that, then it's very, very good. Just finally, on the land sector in particular, and the negotiations which are going on at the moment, and be also an issue I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists and people here, is that we are considering what we do in climate change both immediately, and we're currently developing the new agreement, the new regime. So we have both the two elements, for those, assuming you're all following it, of the raising ambition immediately before 2020, and then this opportunity that we have to develop a new regime post-2020. And that does seem to be an excellent opportunity to not only build on what we've done in REDD, but look at other sectors as well. And Australia just highlighted and suggested in the negotiations on the new agreement and on raising ambition immediately that we do more in the land sector. It's certainly a priority for Australia. We are developing some new methodologies in savanna burning in particular, and it's any of you who are here who are available to attend the COP sessions later in the week, we're having our own side event on our savanna burning methodology, which is a way of timing burns in savanna environments earlier in the year so that you reduce emissions. So the land sector, we think, is one that's very important and one that we should do more, and how we integrate that with RED Plus is important. And so because we've got this opportunity of this new regime, it is a very good time to be injecting ideas into the international negotiations, getting new items on the agenda and pushing those forward. And we hope that one of the outcomes of the negotiations will be that it's not just a negotiation between governments, but we also get many, many more ideas from stakeholders. We get many, many more ideas from communities, that we hold some technical workshops, that we don't immediately launch into negotiations where we talk across purposes with one another, but that we do start to get everybody involved. We get the whole international community involved in the types of directions we take in building a new regime. And then that can incentivize action much more broadly, because we'll have this much broader range of ideas, and hopefully come up with something that has bigger gains from a climate change perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for those views, and I'm particularly interested in your aspects of institutional change, and by bringing different disciplines together that can actually drive that change. And maybe that is what we are now looking towards in bringing together Forest and Agriculture Day into a Landscape Day next year. That may also drive some change in our thinking. And also, very interesting to hear that there may be a prospect in the negotiations to talk about these things. And I think that really is something that we should discuss further today, tomorrow during Agriculture Day, and see what we can do to help that. So thank you for that intervention. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have about 20 minutes or so for that. Let's start here at the front. Do we have microphones?
I used to be a teacher. I can speak loudly.
We can try it that way. Otherwise, you will have a microphone just now.
Hello, yes, my name is Mark Patry. I'm with the World Heritage Center at UNESCO. I'm the focal point for the World Heritage Forest. We have 106 World Heritage forests covering over 75 million hectares around the world. And I'm sorry to say this is my first Forest Day, and I'm learning that it's the last Forest Day. So I feel like I've missed out on a very interesting process over the past few years. But I suppose I don't have a question, but rather a statement here. I'm concerned that I see Forest Day, and the words below the date says shaping, the name says shaping the global agenda for forests and climate change. And under agricultural landscapes and livelihoods, I see solutions for people in the dry lands and beyond. And I'm wondering whether we're losing the focus on climate change when we talk about landscapes. And I mean, landscapes, it's clear. It's a more organic way of looking at the issue. But sitting here, perhaps as someone who's new to the process, I find myself agreeing with what you're saying, but then having to remind myself that, oh, this is about climate change, and let's not forget that. And perhaps we should remind ourselves, because we'll be going back to our respective communities and constituencies, to not forget to link this. If we meld the two, we're always focusing on the climate change mitigation and adaptation, in my case, in my interest perspective. So perhaps the question to the panelists would be, are we forgetting this? Do you see ourselves forgetting this? I've worked in my past on watershed management, which is very similar. We talked about ecosystem approach, which also has very similar concepts. Are we losing the focus on climate change here? Because we tend to gravitate to something which is more organic, which makes us feel good, is very inclusive, but we may lose the focus. This is just the question I raised. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's continue over here, and then I'll try to move back in the room to the other.
Thank you. I'm Kriton Arsenis. I'm the European Parliament's Rapporteur on Forest and on LULUCF. I would like to congratulate CIFOR and Forest Day for choosing this topic, because it's a really challenging topic, but to the point. I was wondering why in the discussion in the panel we didn't hear the word tourism, because it is an activity that, although it cannot be developed in all places in the world because there's not the demand, but it gives value to the landscape, so it's very important. Something else we didn't hear, and I would like the opinion of the panel, is the issue of financing. A lot of landscapes stop to be alive and get destroyed because development banks do finance negative projects in these landscapes, projects that destroy the landscapes. At the same time, there is the passive financing. We see agriculture and the forest. If we don't help these people increase their productivity, they will have to go towards the forest because they need to increase their income by getting the forest land and transforming it into agriculture. So we need to address also these two issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll take one more question over here, and then I'll move to the other side of the room. Thank you.
My name is Edmund Barrow from IUCN. I've got two simple little questions. Why, we're all converted to forests and so forth, why are forests and the importance thereof not on the political agenda in any real way? We've just had the US elections. How often was forest mentioned? We're about to have elections in Kenya next year. Environment and forests are not on the agenda yet, on the political agenda. Two, if we're at least starting to talk as foresters and agrics together, great. How can we get the value of forests into financial planning in government ministries, particularly ministries of finance? And in order to do that, how do we get forests responsibly accounted for at the national level? And there are at least two people in the panel who should be able to partially answer some of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to look for diversity here, first in geography and later hopefully in gender. So please.
Thank you. My name is Faisal Parish, Global Environment Center based in Malaysia. I certainly support this integrated landscape approach. And I feel that this is one of the challenges that we're facing. And I think in the past we have often seen forest and agriculture as, in a way, competing opposites, that the agriculture development would lead to the forest conversion. So I support the move towards integrated approach. I've been working for many years in Southeast Asia on the issue of peatlands, and the big problem there with the peatland drainage and opening up for agriculture, leading to fires, leading to the degradation of the adjacent forests. And that's now the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the region, is that development. The problem, the question that you asked in the beginning of institutional arrangements, that's a big challenge. Because I think in every country we have forest departments, we have agriculture departments, and only very rarely is there any mechanism for integrated landscape management department. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenge to move to the more integrated approach. And I think there is also a risk that if we just say integrated approach, then neither the forest department or the agriculture department want to support it or want to be involved. So how can, from the top policy layer down, and how can the financing institutions play a role in facilitating that there has to be this integrated approach? The business as usual cannot continue, and how do we bring those institutions together so we do get an integrated way of working? Because I think that will be essential for the future. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is a good time to go back to the panel. How do we create the political momentum for landscapes, or should we? Shall we start with Matthew again, please?
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, just to come to the, to the first question, are we losing the focus on climate change? I don't think so. If we follow a landscape approach. I mean, I suppose theoretically it's conceivable you could. If you regard trees as basically carbon sticks and it's all about, mitigation for climate change, then theoretically you could, but there's no... Is that better? Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. But at the moment, there's no kind of... At the moment, with the state the carbon markets are in, I think we can't rely on simply having sufficient climate finance to drive change in this area. So what we need is, why we need integrated approaches, if what you really care about is climate change mitigation, the reason you should care about landscapes is it's because through a kind of landscape approach that involves local communities, that empowers local communities to manage their resources better, you will end up getting the trees standing. If what you care about is the people, then a landscape approach will also help, because by helping get the trees keeping the trees standing and enabling people to benefit from them, you get the benefits for people, and similarly for environmental benefits. So I think that by looking at the three things together, whether your driver is primarily climate change, or it's the people who live in the areas, or it's because we talked about orangutans earlier on, if it's because you like orangutans, in a sense doesn't matter. What matters is what's going to work. And what's going to work, you're not going to be able to achieve one objective if you don't actually look at all of them together. So I would argue quite strongly, I think, that we're not taking the focus off climate change. And the other thing, of course, you did also mention adaptation, and that's really key. And I think the role of forests and sustainably managed landscapes in adaptation is absolutely crucial and key. So I think, what we need to do is to find the win-wins, and there are definitely many, many of them out there. And at the margin, there may be some trade-offs, but I think there's an awful lot we can actually do with all this. Why aren't forests higher up the political agenda? I mean, that is a really difficult one. Perhaps others will have more to say about that than I will. I mean, I think it's a problem for all of us that climate change isn't high enough the political agenda in many of the countries in which we live. And, if you only have to look in my own country, you only have to look at the way that climate change is treated in the press or so on to see that it's a real uphill struggle. I mean, political leaders are trying to show leadership here, but, climate change itself isn't high enough up the agenda. Forests do sometimes hit the agenda, perhaps more than one would think. Domestically in the UK, we had a big scandal actually about a year ago about the management of what remains, we've chopped most of them down, but what remains of most of the forests within the UK. And I think that certainly one of the aspects of climate change perhaps that resonates with the public in my country more than others is the whole question of forests, because people can instinctively understand what forests mean, perhaps more than they can understand what tons of CO2 emissions mean as well. So I think that we maybe have an opportunity with forests and maybe broader landscapes to kind of use some of the narratives around those to try and raise the whole question of climate change up the political agenda. But I share some of what I detected with some of the frustration which was there. And then the final thing I'll comment on, because you need to let other panelists talk as well, but it's this question about how do you get ministries of finance to actually recognize the value of forests in what they're doing. I mean, I think that this is something where probably many of us would feel that the ball has been dropped simply on the kind of the way we do accounting. I think the economics of biodiversity study that was done by Pavan Sukhdev has helped to kind of put this very much back on the agenda with UNEP and the World Bank. And of course, the World Bank's leading, I'm sure you'll talk about that, Mary, about the WAVES partnership on wealth accounting to try and make sure that one does do a much better job of integrating the value of forests, the environmental services that they provide into financial accounting so that they actually get counted and that decisions are therefore made on that basis. I think we've got a long way to go there, but again, there are a lot of win-wins in there, which suggests to me that it's a very fruitful avenue for us to go down. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Who wants to go next? We take the same order. Mary, please.
Okay. I just will build briefly on the adaptation side of the question, because I think we tend to, I talked a little bit about trees, and we tend to focus on primary forests, but we also shouldn't forget that 25% of Africa, for example, is covered by dryland forests, and they also sequester carbon. And I think we also shouldn't forget that agroforestry and tree crops, you also sequester carbon. And that's where you can look for a triple win, where you are increasing productivity, but you're also sequestering carbon and hopefully increasing people's incomes at the same time. But that's not to say that you can't do that without serious planning, and I think that's what the landscape approach is about. And so I think it is something that looks pretty closely at adaptation, and I agree that adaptation is absolutely essential and that we need to really scale up our efforts across across all institutions in that regard. On the how will we get the ministers of finance to responsibly account for forests, I think this goes back to the natural capital accounting, and the bank led an effort among many partners to try to ramp up natural capital accounting in the run-up to Rio, and we secured the signatures of 62 countries that are willing to start looking at this. But what they're building on is a change in the UN statistical economic accounts, which says now that when you look at your GDP, you shouldn't just be looking at their traditional accounts. There are 17 sub-accounts that a country puts together for its GDP. Now they've added a new set of accounts which values natural capital, and that includes forests. So that's a start, but it'll take a lot of effort for countries to be able to actually meet those standards and to have the data to measure the value of their forests. And I think that's something where there's a lot of renewed effort going into, but it needs to scale up quickly so that we can make better decisions and that we're looking at the real value of assets. I could go on about that for quite a while, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Isildha, would you like to comment on the questions?
Yes, I'll take a few. First, the comment on the fact that we have not mentioned tourism as one of the key activities within the landscape. I think it is an important sector, and it has shown, when we implement community-based natural resource management, that there are several tourism-related activities which are contributing to the maintenance of forest landscapes and the forest services. So I think it's an important sector within the whole landscape in terms of looking at what is there and how to plan better the utilization of those landscapes. In relation to the institutions, I was here earlier and in one of the panel, and one of the panelists was saying, with RED we seem to be stopping and even not looking at what institutions we have and planning frameworks we have in order to move ahead and start implementing activities. And what I would like to say in relation to the issue of institutional setup is that it's not only agriculture and forestry institutions which are there. There are ministries which have a mandate of cross-sector coordination. So we have a platform that we should capitalize on. We have the Environment Ministry, which has, the responsibility of looking across the board whether the policies are promoting sustainable environmental management. And I think if we work with those institutions that already exist, we can start to take steps towards implementing the landscape approach. On the issue of how to integrate the forestry in the national accounts, I think one of the key challenges that some countries which have tried to integrate forestry accounting into the national systems have faced is the issue related to capacity. In terms of training, the ability to collect information systematically and analyze in order to inform the national accounts and demonstrate that the growth which is reported in terms of the GDP also needs to take into account the depletion of the natural resources that might be associated with those development indicators. So I think investing in capacity is a key aspect, and many countries are still limited in that sense. Not that the governments are not sensitized in terms of the importance, but they need also to be supported with capacity to address that issue. I think other questions have been commented on by others. I won't repeat. Thank you.
Thanks. Justin, any comments from your side?
Just briefly, just very, how's that? My ear's not big enough, I think, so I can't hold it on there. But just briefly, I certainly agree with everything that's said, including the comments from the floor. But I think one of the real problems is how do you incentivize and innovate? I think we still need to prove the methodologies to a large degree. I guess our approach to climate change is that we have been struggling trying to tell people what they shouldn't be doing, and we really, which is one very important element, but we do need to be looking at proving the concepts, proving the methodologies that will incentivize more action. And I think if we look at the RED scheme as well, we've approached it from a sense that this is an opportunity to sequester carbon, this is an opportunity to do that. Clearly that can't be an approach in itself. Clearly it has to be a much wider approach. So this is just one additional value that has been added that can be utilised to conserve forests, to protect forests, to increase the value of forests, but it has to be put within a framework or within a methodology that can really get the value of those forests increased to the community and to the local communities. And for the RED area in particular, I think we're still really struggling with the proving of the concept. And so we really do need a lot of work in that area. And I think that applies to climate change more broadly. It goes from the very micro to the development of the individual projects to the national level, where if we're wanting to get countries to do things, we need to be providing them with the means to be able to deliver on that. And clearly we're hearing that from developing countries as well. And so we do have the interest to provide the resources whereby we can incentivize action rather than just putting up limitations to what countries should be doing.
Thank you, Justin. We are running a little short of time, and what I would like to do is to see what questions we have online, because we have attendants that are asking questions through the web, and we have soon a microphone to hear what those questions are.
I feel like I'm the syndicate leader of the online syndicate. You have two naughty questions and a very sage question. Start with the sage one first, is a reminder that education and information availability for farmers are important to translate the science to, specifically on forest and forest management, deforestation, bring that over to the farmers. Then there is the two naughty ones. One of the people picked up on what one of the speakers said, saying something like, I hear every time I go to conferences, I hear new terms, and apparently this new term I hear this year is landscapes and landscapes approaches. Then other people picked up and saying, well, is this really describing well what we mean as an integrated approach? Or is it only us, the insiders, who actually understand what we mean by landscape approach? Or is it only the World Bank who actually understands and is wildly enthusiastic about the term? Then the second remark is, everybody likes to say that forests are integral and crucial to climate change adaptation. But do they mean adaptation or mitigation? Never anybody explains why landscapes are crucial to climate change adaptation. For instance, climate sequestration is a mitigation and not adaptation. Are we talking about forest in the terms of mitigation, climate change mitigation, or adaptation? Thank you.
Okay, that was a set of very complicated statements and questions. I think we will have difficulties to run through them as a panel. I'd like to thank the contributions that we received online. I think we will not be able to address those questions in the time we have allocated. In fact, we've already gone over time. So by that, for my part, I would like to start summing up this session. I would like to thank the panel for your words of wisdom, the floor for your questions, highlighting that we may not actually be able to answer what we mean by a landscape approach just yet. But that was also a very important objective of this session, to highlight that it is easy to talk about landscapes, but how do we actually make them work? We've highlighted a number of institutional aspects, a number of political awareness aspects, and got some indications on ways forward, experience being gained within institutions, including the World Bank, within countries, and I think we are on the right track, but there is still some way to walk, and by that I would like to close this session, and I would like to thank the panel with give them a hand.